welcome back to the DTVC Extra podcast. As always, this is Matt here, and we're going to finish up our look at the Superman series today with Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, and then in the next segment, we'll look at Superman Returns. So I kind of thought, like, these are the non-DC Extended Universe Supermans. I guess I don't know how to group them, but you kind of have the idea of how I'm grouping them, right? That we have 1, 2, 3, Supergirl, 4, and then, because Superman Returns is supposed to be sort of like a soft reboot / redo sequel, so that's why I included that in here. Also, it kind of makes for a nice even 6. But anyway, why don't we get started here on Superman 4? Superman 4 comes out in 1987. I remember this one coming out in the theater. It was kind of there was a sense, even for me as like an 8-year-old, kind of the vibe that I was getting from older people around me, that this was cash grabby, afterthought-ish, all of those kinds of things. And there was a sense that people were done with Superman. They were tired of it, that it was enough for them at this stage, which lends itself to probably why this movie doesn't do as well. There are a few other things I think to consider with this movie, or I don't know if things to consider necessarily, but ways that I kind of look at it, or I frame this movie. When we think of comic book movies, of course, we think of the Superman series, the original, especially the first two, as the archetype, right, of what superhero movies sort of become, especially with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They take a lot from the first two Superman films, but I think even like DC Extended Universe, they pull from Superman. So that's one piece of it, right? Superman himself is the archetype for the superhero, that when he's created by Siegel and Schuster in the late 30s, a lot of the elements that we see, whether it's the superpowers, the secret identity, the origins and the alien origins or whatever it is, the outfit, right, the boots, the skin tight onesie or whatever I would call it, the cape, all of that. That's really, all of that stuff kind of comes from Superman. So he's sort of seen as that standard by which, right, that superheroes are kind of judged against. And so by 1987, I think there was maybe a sense of like, we need something new. I think that was part of the feeling. The other thing, of course, is that there's this late 80s, early 90s low budget comic book phenomena. And I think this movie kind of starts that as well. So we get the Captain America film, the Albert Pyun Captain America. We get Dolph Lundgren's Punisher. We get that Fantastic Four movie that never actually happens, right? But that still kind of exists there. I'm trying to think of some other ones that, from that time period. But I think those are the big ones. I mean, the Return of Swamp Thing, I think comes a little bit after this, the Wynorski version of Swamp Thing. So that's another piece of things. And what's interesting about this movie is that it kind of straddles the two lines, right? Because in a way, it feels like it's one of those low-budget, non-major studio comic book movies that, again, we look at now, we think, how could these studios be even allowed to make comic book movies? But so it has that feel. But then on the other hand, it definitely feels like it's a part of the overall Superman series, right? It's got the major stars. It's got Christopher Reeve. It's got Gene Hackman, Margot Kidder. So it has that feel like it belongs as part of that as well. So it belongs in a few different places, right? It belongs as a part of the original Superman series that has those major iconic films that we expect. But it also belongs with the the Dolph Lundgren Punisher and the Fantastic Four movie that we never saw as that kind of low budget comic book movie that, again, is something that we'll probably never see again, that it'll never happen again. So interesting that it inhabits those multiple spaces in that way. At least for me, I find that to be really interesting. Now I think it's interesting to maybe even just get to how we get here, how we get to Cannon and Golan-Globus doing a Superman film. So when we left off last time, the Salkinds had done Supergirl and it didn't go well. It's the only one out of these, including this one we're going to be talking about here, to not turn a profit from its original budget. But the Salkinds were looking at it like they didn't have the money to make Superman they want the way that Superman was going to be required to be made. I think after the first two movies, when they made the third one, they were already starting to feel like the amount of money it was going to cost to make a Superman movie and make it the way they wanted to, they were feeling like they weren't going to be able to pull that off. So they try to sell Superman to Dino De Laurentiis. He doesn't buy it. And then, after this, the Superman 3 doesn't do as well, even though it still makes roughly 3 times its budget. It doesn't do as well as the first two do. And when that happens, when it doesn't make as much money, Warner decides they don't want to distribute Supergirl, and then so Supergirl ends up kind of in limbo. It gets cut down. It doesn't do as well, and so at that point the Salkinds want out. And if you watch the Electric Boogaloo, the wild untold story of Cannon Films, you know that this comes at the same time that Cannon is in two places themselves, right? They're in this place where Golan, especially Golan, but Golan-Globus, they want to move Cannon into making it one of these major prestige studios, right? They want to be a Warner Brothers, a Paramount, something like that. So they want Cannon to be moved into that space. At the same time, they're in trouble financially, right? Every movie that they make is essentially paying for the previous movie, right? Any money that they get to make that movie, it pays for what they didn't, what the budget overruns for the previous one, or the failures of the previous movie. So obviously we know Cannon right here on the site. I mean, Cannon is responsible for some of the best action stuff of the 80s. I mean, the American Ninja movies, fantastic. Shokazuki Ninja movies, the Death Wish sequels that, for all of the kind of bad messaging in them, they were a lot of fun to watch. Invasion USA, so many great films. And so if Cannon never did this movie, if Cannon never did Masters of the Universe, it's interesting to think about like where they would be. But I don't think Menachem Golan never would have been satisfied with just the Chuck Norris and the Bronson and the Dudikoff films, right? He always wanted to go bigger. He always had those aspirations to be there. And so Superman gives him that, right? Superman is one of the major franchises at that time. Now, it wasn't as major by the time the third one comes out. It's not as major. It's so. I mean, if you think of it like kind of the big ones, the ones that were based off of previous products, right? Which I guess Star Wars was created on its own through Lucas. Jaws had fallen off quite a bit by this time as well, right? We know those sequels, but of course, Superman kind of lends itself better to sequels than that, and it still wasn't doing as well because Part 3. Indiana Jones films, right? They are doing better. Back to the Future films, another franchise doing better. Of course, we talked about Star Trek in a previous one, and it's interesting because Star Trek at this time, they're moving in a better direction. I think we talked about how their Part 3 was better than this Part 3, right? And I think that's an important distinction, that the Part 3 that they did, where it was just sort of like Get Me Over Part 3, it allowed them to really shine with Part 4. So Part 4, of course, comes out a year before this one. But it's a really successful movie, both in terms of the budget and the money that it makes, but also in terms of the reception and how people were enjoying it. And it's interesting even just to think my own experience, and maybe I'm remembering it wrong. Of course, I wasn't that old, 7 or 8 years old. But to remember Star Trek 4 coming out and not being an afterthought, but being something that people were excited to see, and there was a buzz around it, whereas Superman 4 already had that. And I would think probably the reason why it had that people weren't excited for it buzz was I think that as the production's going on, things are leaking out about how bad this movie is being made, and I think that was going to always probably, once that word gets out, people decide that they're not interested in seeing it. The critics start to pan it, but other people are like, I don't think you want to see this movie. I don't think this is going to be that good. And so why don't we get into all of that? Why don't we get into that all of that stuff here as we discuss the film? So Golan-Globus, they get the rights from the Salkinds to make Superman 4, and their mindset is, we got to go big. But it's interesting. Their mindset is we got to go big, but as we talk about this here, they don't go as big as they probably should have. So they pay to get Christopher Reeve, right? Christopher Reeve agrees not only to make the movie, but he has a pet project of his own that he wanted to make, and so Cannon agreed to produce that if he did this film. He also got writing credits on this, so those were things that he insisted on, and he got those. Hackman, they paid quite a bit to get Hackman back. They got Kidder back. And then in terms of other co-stars, we get John Cryer. So interesting with John Cryer, because he talked about when they were making this movie that I think as it was being made, Christopher Reeve took him aside and said, "This isn't going to be good, kid." And he was like, "Oh boy." I mean, Cryer's character, he plays this sort of like this teen from that time, but it's very different from Ducky on in Pretty in Pink, right? Where in this character, he's like, "Whoa, Uncle Lex, man, this super dude is really giving us a hard time," and which was a lot of fun there. I mean, I would say of the two characters, right, you would think that this character doesn't age as well as Ducky. But really, when you think about Ducky's character, doesn't age well at all. Because I think Ducky's character was a poster child for what's an obsessive relationship, right? What is stalking, stalking by phone, those kinds of things. I think any commercials that, for parents warning teens about obsessive behavior, they would be like, yeah, Ducky, with how he treats Molly Ringwald, that there's that there. The other thing, too, of course, is Pretty in Pink had a better villain, because we're going to talk about the villain here as well, the Nuclear Man villain. I read a few different things about the Nuclear Man villain, what they were going for there. I think that there was a sense that they wanted to maybe do Bizarro Superman, but they just didn't have the budget for it. I don't know how well Christopher Reeve wanted to play two parts. So they kind of split the difference, with this Nuclear Man character. I don't know that the Nuclear Man character on his own would have been so bad. I think inventing a new villain but making him be a supervillain, had they made him cooler, I think it would have been better. But he's kind of not cooler, right? As we'll see when we get into that. But yeah, as the movie's going on, I believe Sidney J. Furie directs. So we know Sidney J. Furie on the site here from Detention. I think it's Direct Action, right? Because Direct Contact is the one Dolph did with Michael Paré. So it's Direct Action is the one that Sidney J. Furie did. The Rage, I believe, is also Sidney J. Furie. So that's one, not to be confused with Rage from PM Entertainment, but The Rage with Lorenzo Lamas, Gary Busey, and Roy Scheider. Roy Scheider gives us a little, as the guys that come up with call it, Scheider Fu. A very interesting one. I think that's the one also where Lamas' character starts crying when he's talking about being a part of the FBI and how it doesn't uphold its values anymore, which was a hilarious scene. It was a beautiful scene. So anyway, that's Sidney J. Furie. So he gets called on to direct this, and I think he's told that he's going to have a budget somewhere like in the 30 million range, maybe more, 30, 35. And then immediately once he starts, they're told, no, we're cutting that budget down to 17 million. So that meant there were a lot of things in the movie that they had to change, cut out. So they were originally going to have a Bizarro Superman who was going to be like an original version of Nuclear Man. They had to cut that out. There's a scene in the film where the Great Wall, the Great Wall of China is it's smashed, and then Superman puts it back together kind of through magic by them just reversing the camera image and making it, essentially playing it on rewind. They were originally going to have him like very quickly, like, using his super speed, put it back together, and they didn't have the budget for that kind of thing. The flying doesn't look as good as it does in the previous movies, including Part 3, including Supergirl. Again, with the budget for this, they had to cut the budget, and so it doesn't look as good there. Some of the fight scenes, things like that, they just don't look as nice. But then another thing happens. I believe this movie was supposed to be over 2 hours long, like the previous previous entries in the series. And when Golan-Globus got wind of the length, they started thinking about the fact that they had in their mind this was going to be a blockbuster. And they were right to think that. The previous three movies, they didn't make any less than $100 million. And so there was probably a sense of, okay, we're a $17 million film, we should be looking at $100 million off the bus, right? And then anything after that is even better. So the mindset was, if we're going to be trying to make $100 million, we could make more if the movie was shorter, because then the theaters could play it more times, right? So you could get more showings in a day if it's an hour and a half versus, 2 hours, 20 minutes, whatever it was that they were originally going to be. So they cut the thing down to an hour and a half. Now, I don't know that there's a restored cut out there for like we have for these other movies. Even Supergirl, right, has a restored cut. I don't know, because when I watched this on Max, it was the 90-minute version. But yeah, so a lot of decisions. So again, we talk about go big or go home. The go big part for Cannon, it was like they went big in some places, like again getting the cast and everybody involved, but they also went home in other cases, right? And they went home when it came to the budget. They went home when it came to cutting this thing down and hoping to squeeze as much money out of it as they could. And ultimately it works and it doesn't work, right? Because this movie is a $17 million budget, it grosses about $30 million. So it does better than its budget, but not like the 3 or 4 times the budget that you would want a movie like this to be. But it does have that distinction. So, Supergirl still has the distinction of being the only one that doesn't make its budget back. So it does make that money back. So before I go further, I want to give a quick synopsis here, because I think the synopsis is kind of fun and an important part of the deal. This takes place sometime after the previous movie, Part 3. We're not sure how long after Part 3. We're not sure even how much the events of Part 3 affect this movie. But what happens is Superman is still being Superman, kind of doing his Superman thing, and there's a talk about nuclear weapons, and a kid says, well, why can't Superman just get rid of them? So that's what the plan is. And then Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor, he gets broken out of jail by his nephew, Lenny, played by John Cryer, and he goes to some museum and steals hair that Superman has donated a piece of his hair, which can like lift, hold a weight. And so he has this idea that if he takes this hair, and then Superman is planning to remove or eliminate all nuclear weapons. Well, if he could get this piece of hair along with, he uses the hair to, I guess, generate some DNA of Superman. So it's like kind of this like this lump of cells. And if he can put it on one of the nuclear missiles that Superman's disposing of, and he's disposing of these nuclear missiles by throwing them into the sun. If he does that, then he could, essentially create a being strong enough to beat Superman, and he does. He creates Nuclear Man, who I believe was played by a male model from England named Mark Pillow. He doesn't speak at all, of course, in the movie. Gene Hackman's voice does the voice of Nuclear Man as well. Beautifully feathered hair. Looks fantastic there. The outfit looks great. But for some reason, he has these big, long claws. And when he fights Superman, at one point, he uses the claws and he scratches Superman and gives him a really severe cold, like maybe like pneumonia, maybe that level of cold, but definitely bad flu that Superman has to kind of recover from, which he eventually goes to the Fortress of Solitude and does that. Actually, I forgot too. Right, that's right. I forgot that he. No. I'm getting confused with Superman Returns. Hackman doesn't go to the Fortress of Solitude, I don't think, to do anything. But anyway, Superman doesn't either. He goes to his old home in Kansas and finds a crystal there that gives him powers to restore himself, I believe, something along those lines. It's all kind of convoluted, right? And eventually Superman and Nuclear Man, they go fight on the moon. There's another story in the background where we get Mariel Hemingway. She plays the daughter of this billionaire who buys the Daily Planet and is trying to turn it into a tabloid using outrageous headlines, which we now, of course, would joke, it would be like New York Times pitchbot kind of headlines, but they're, at that time, right, they were considered sensational. It's interesting. It's a commentary on the newspaper business. I think, Golan and Globus, they probably felt like they were hard done by a lot of media because of the way that their films were made, and I think this was sort of their commentary on that. But now it's a commentary that makes a lot of sense, especially in America in the age of Trump, where it's like you get these news organizations that rather than really kind of come at Trump, they kind of want Trump. They kind of need him because he creates this massive news cycle that this billionaire, because billionaires will own a lot of these newspapers. I think Bezos owns the Washington Post. The billionaire owner of the Red Sox, John Henry, owns the Boston Globe. So that's part of it. Is these billionaires own these newspapers, and they kind of want to keep the spin going. So at least in that sense, it's interesting. Something that's topical today. We get in this movie here. But yeah, Superman fights Nuclear Man. He fights him on the moon, fights him on Earth, and eventually he's able to dispatch him and send him to his death or whatever. And everybody lives happily ever after. There's definitely issues with the story, and I think the issues with the story come from the fact that things were edited, right? That the story kind of jumps from place to place sometimes. It does make references to Superman 2 a little bit with this idea that Lois Lane may remember some of the things that happened in Superman 2, despite the fact that she's given this kiss that makes her forget everything. They use the kiss that makes her forget again in this movie, so they use that device a second time. The idea of the scratching is interesting because it's like, the idea of Nuclear Man scratching Superman and making him sick, because you'd think he would just do that all the time, right? Like instead of like punching Superman and throwing him and smashing him, into the ground on the moon and all those things that he does, you think you just always want to scratch him, and that Superman would have to block being scratched. But no, that's not really how that works. It's just he uses the scratch one time and then that's it. Superman never has to overcome it again. It's never a problem again. It's never anything he has to do again. So so there's that. I mean, Gene Hackman as the baddie in this, I don't think he's like mailing it in. I think we get a good Gene Hackman performance. But I think there's a sense that he doesn't have a lot to work with here, and he's just going to kind of do his best with what he's got to work with, and just kind of, hey, get his paycheck and earn that money. I think the John Cryer piece of this, I'm sure if Reeve took him aside and said this is going to be bad, that was probably one of those things for him where he's like, oh boy. He's carved out quite a career for himself, I think, being on 2.5 Men. So I think we can't say it all worked out bad for him, but that. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I liked his character in this. I actually got a kick out of his character. But I think it's the things. The performances work enough for me. But I don't know if you can hear that we got sirens going on here in the background. So it's Philly, right? I'm kind of dealing with Philly again. So But the other thing, of course, is that one of the co-stars in this is Jim Broadbent, who he was in a movie called Another Year, which I really loved. Came out in 2010. I think it was nominated for Best Screenplay. So seeing Broadbent in this was nice. I think out of all the actors who were in this, and of course we get all the people who are coming back from previous attempts, Broadbent was a lot of fun. And I think Broadbent you can kind of put in that same category as a Gene Hackman. I mean, Gene Hackman's a bigger movie star than Broadbent, but you still get this idea of also William Hootkins, who I think came up on an episode of After Movie Diner I was on with John Cross. But I'm just kind of Hackman, Broadbent, Hootkins, they turn in these professional, fun performances that I think is kind of like one of those deals where they must have known what was going on with this production. They probably weren't all that excited about it, but they've got their bigger roles that they can kind of lean on in their careers, and they've kind of just always done this. I know Christopher Reeves talked about this one. I think he said this one in part 3 he wouldn't let his dad see. That's how embarrassed he was by these movies. I guess for me, I don't know that I would be embarrassed about this movie. I guess Reeve maybe more so than everybody else because he co-wrote it. And so it's like his writing is on there. I think he played a part in the production of the film. I should say he co-wrote it. He wrote it, I think. I think it was his story. I guess he did some second unit directing on a few things. That's right. It was him, and then we had some other people, Mark Rosenthal, Lawrence Conner, who were helping Reeve write it. But he also did some directing. He got to work behind the camera, so we got to do some other things here. But I think because he took his career very seriously, I think he felt like this thing was a joke, and that I actually kind of had this feeling that the movie was kind of like the old Batman, that it was supposed to be received like the old Batman. Watching it this time through, I don't see that sense. I mean, this movie was meant to be serious, and it just was. It was on such a low budget. There were so many cuts that were made to it that it's not anything. It just doesn't come out well, right? Doesn't turn out well, and as well as it should have. But by the same token, I don't know. I'm not going to white knight this movie for sure. I mean, it's fun. It's a fun watch, and it's fun. That hour and a half that Golan-Globus cut it down to try to make more money out of it. That hour and a half actually comes in terms of making it a breezy watch, right? If you're going to rewatch it, you're in and out in 90 minutes. That's not so bad. But I think because it does harken forward, not harken back, because it predates them, to some of these other comic book movies that I enjoy, like the Albert Pyun's Captain America, like the Dolph Lundgren Punisher, where I finally saw the Roger Corman's Fantastic Four. The fact that this feels like it belongs with those, despite the fact that it was a big screen production, is just such a really interesting element to this that I really enjoyed, and it was kind of a fun thing there to at least be able to do that. But then I guess it's interesting to think about this movie's legacy, because one is it is included with the other Superman films on Max, so you can watch it with the other ones. It's included in the box sets. Like Supergirl isn't included in the box sets, I don't believe. I think it's usually just the 5 movies. So it's these 4 plus the Brandon Routh, Bryan Singer kind of soft reboot sort of deal. But so it unlike say Captain America, Albert Pyun Captain America, or Dolph Lundgren Punisher, I mean, it would be fun to see those movies on Disney Plus. I think Disney Plus should pick those movies up and include them with the other movies that they have. But that's not how those movies have been treated by Time, right? They're not included like that. And when you go on Max, I mean, Revenge of the Swamp Thing also isn't on there. I think it's on Return of the Swamp Thing. I believe it's on Tubi, but it's not on Max. So that's interesting, that piece there, that it kind of exists. it's part of its legacy is the fact that it's always going to be included with these other Superman films. It is held up as an equal piece, at least for these first four. So there's that part of the legacy. But I think the other piece is the fact that our understanding, or what people wanted from a comic book movie, had changed at this point. That they were kind of tired of the extremely nice, really good guy Superman character, and they were looking for something darker. And so you have, 2 years after this, 1989, it's almost like the environment was really perfect and ripe for Tim Burton's his Batman. And I'm not saying that this movie birthed Tim Burton's Batman or birthed the reaction or response or reception to Tim Burton's Batman. But I don't think it hurt either. I think people looked at this and were like, okay, Superman's done. We're done with Superman. Let's look at something else here. And then here comes Tim Burton. He's like, here's my Batman. What do you think of my Batman? And suddenly his Batman was everywhere, right? Remember there was the Prince song, Bat Dance. Remember the shirts? Everybody had those T-shirts with that bat logo that was like it wasn't just your regular Batman logo from like the old show or something like that. It was that kind of that gold and black one from the movie. Some of the things that kind of changed the way comic book movies market their films, because remember, when Batman comes out in 1989, they sell a lot of rights to things. DC and Warner sell a lot of the rights to things, and one of those things was the trading cards. So then when trading cards became cool in the early 90s, when they made their DC trading card set, they couldn't include Batman because they'd sold those rights. Batman kind of starts to become much more walled off at this time, and he becomes his own thing after this. And there is a sense too, of course, Batman, just like Superman 1 and 2, right? We get a really fantastic Batman 1 and 2. I actually like Batman Returns better than the first Batman, whereas I don't like Superman 2 better than Superman 1. But they're still two really effective films. And there was a sense that this was kind of going to be the way to go. Though it's interesting that there was a sense that this was going to be the way to go for comic book movies. But the comic book movies we get after Batman are, The Shadow, The Phantom, those kinds of comic book movies. You get these Dark Horse ones. You get The Crow, of course, which we're now seeing being remade here. The Mask is one. And then kind of more offbeat but still dark ones like Tank Girl. Though Tank Girl, I think they kind of water down a bit of the darkness to it. And even with the Batman itself, right? I mean, after we get these first two, when Joel Schumacher takes over, there's the third one, that third one I think kind of fits the way you would want a third. It's more like the Star Trek third movie than it is the Superman third movie, where Joel Schumacher doesn't really try to do anything unique with it. He just kind of he takes it over and kind of wants, it's like a get me over so I can make my Batman movie. And his Batman movie, of course, Batman and Robin, it's kind of critically panned. I always love that one just because I love George Clooney in a suit. I like the colors in it. I like the way it looked and everything. It was a fun movie, but I get why people didn't like it. And it kind of caused another reckoning with comic book movies. And then we get Blade, right? Blade kind of resets the comic book thing. And then, Marvel starts making their movies and suddenly they become a force, right? With the X-Men movies and Superman movies. Spider-Man movies. But, at the time, it's kind of hard, you have to kind of go back and think about the fact that comic book movies in the 80s, it was really just Superman, right? That's all you had at that time, and that that Golan-Globus' mindset, they had bought a real property that they were going to make a lot of money off of, but they Golan-Globused it. Is that a verb? Can we use that, Golan-Globus, to Golan-Globus something? They Golan-Globus this one. To the tune of $30 million, right? I mean, it's better than I think a lot of their movies, and again, it does make a profit, but they needed more profit, right? That $13 million. I mean, they had to have spent a good chunk of that $13 million on the budget to advertise the film, right? So they didn't probably make a lot left, and of course, eventually it catches up with them, right? And they go under. I think that Captain America movie actually wasn't a Cannon film. I think it was like 21st Century. I think that was the company that Menachem Golan picked up after Cannon. So I think that's what Captain America is, but it could also be a Cannon film. I think I have it tagged as a Cannon film, and so there's probably something I'm kind of missing there with that, or maybe it was 21st Century but distributed by Cannon. I can't remember, but anyway, this is a different. This one Captain America was not really meant to be what Superman was, right? Superman was supposed to be instant, easy cash for them. And unfortunately, they Golan-Globus themselves out of that easy, instant cash. And I don't know, had this film been bigger, had they put the money into it, so had they stuck with the original $30 million budget, I feel like if they stuck with the original $30 million, I don't know if they had stuck with that, if this would have pulled in, 9 figures, if it would have made what Superman 3 made. Because it is also possible that if the other issues were there with the production, and once word gets out about those other issues with the production, that maybe that would have been it. Maybe it was sunk to begin with, and because I think that was the sense. I mean, again, I just remember at the time when the movie came out that there wasn't a sense that you wanted to go see this in the theater, and there wasn't a sense that anybody was clamoring to go catch this. Like, obviously I would have been a little young for it. But I remember with Star Trek 4, that was one that everybody was wanting to go see. That one had a lot of buzz. I remember seeing the commercials and everything for it. This just didn't have that. There was already a sense at the time that this was like Jaws 4. That there was like, what are we doing here? Why are we making another Superman movie? And it's kind of too bad. The Golan-Globus gets this, and they kind of see it as, along with the Masters of the Universe movie, they see it as their chance to really make the big time. And the market had changed too much at that point, and that was kind of it. So yeah, why don't we we'll take a break here, and then when we come back, we will look at Superman Returns, the Brandon Routh film. All right, we are back, and we're gonna finish this thing off by looking at Superman Returns from 2006. So 2006, it's 19 years after Superman 4, and a lot has happened to the comic book world and to sort of the dynamics within DC, DC versus Marvel, etc., in that 20-year period. So maybe we'll kind of break those changes down, because there's a lot that happens there. I mean, I think the first thing we kind of already started talking about in the previous segment, Batman starts to kind of take over as the number one property from DC, takes it back from Superman. So, obviously when DC starts out, right, Superman's the number one property there. But then Batman kind of takes it from Superman in the 60s with the TV show that I think people really, really liked, that TV show. And there were a lot of different iterations that kind of came from that. If you remember, there was like the Scooby-Doo, where he would, Batman and Robin would be on Scooby-Doo. They had their own cartoon, a lot of things like that. And so when Superman becomes when the Christopher Reeve, Richard Donner Superman films come out in the late 70s, that changes it. And now Superman is back to being number one. Well, now between the environment, or the sort of the market that was there for comic books, where people were looking for darker heroes, how poorly Superman 4 does, and how well Tim Burton's Batman does, right? We get that flip, and Batman is back on top. The other thing, of course, that happens is that within the comic book world itself, the speculative comic book market is really growing at this time. And this is when I was collecting comics. And I remember when I first started out collecting comics, you would have ones from like Amazing Fantasy. Is that the one? Whatever the one that was like the first the first Spider-Man appearance, or even obviously like Action Comics, right? Action Comic, with Superman, whatever those early first appearances, they were worth a lot, right? But overall, comics themselves were not really collectors the way that like baseball cards were. But that changes in the late 80s, early 90s, and suddenly comic books become that big of a deal. And I know for myself, I got priced out at that time. Probably by like 93, I'm not really collecting as much. I mean, it was just like I'd go to the flea market, and with my $10 allowance, and it's like, oh, there's a Spider-Man's 30th anniversary, so every issue of the 4 Spider-Man books are like $3.50 reverse hologram covers. And it's like, do I need Web of Spider-Man 75 for did I just spend $4 on that? Like, what am I doing? So that's happening, right? At the same time, you have this massive exodus of talent at Marvel that had really grown Marvel to kind of surpass DC. And so from a comic book standpoint, Marvel has sort of taken over, or it's surpassed DC in the late 80s, early 90s, when you on the backs of some really massive talents, right? You've got Todd McFarlane, who was doing Spider-Man at the time, Jim Lee, who takes over with the X-Men, Eric Larson, who else do we got there? Rob Liefeld, right? Can't forget Rob Liefeld, right? Another big name there. A lot of Silvestri, a lot of big names that were really, really pushing things in Marvel, and they become celebrities on their own. I mean, I remember Rob Liefeld doing that Levi's 501 commercial, or they would make appearances on like was it Dennis Miller? Did Dennis Miller have his talk show at that time? I mean, Letterman, they'd be on shows like that. So they were big deals, and you were collecting books because you wanted to see what they would do with them. I mean, I remember like Sam Keith. I remember he did like some Lobo stuff, and then like he did like a Hulk series, and was like, oh, we got to see what's Sam Keith up to. And of course, he ends up going over to Image and creates the Max, which ends up being on Liquid Television, and I actually had its own cartoon, I think, on MTV. But anyway, when that whole crew makes the decision to leave Marvel and form Image, right? One, it hurts Marvel's books. I mean, I remember myself, it was like, oh man, like I don't know how much I want to read these anymore when they don't look the way they looked before. And it wasn't like this big announcement necessarily. Like I didn't have my ear to the ground. There's no internet at that time. I was like, 12 years old, maybe something like that. So I didn't really catch a lot of it. But at the same time, DC, I mean, the one character that DC had that actually had kind of made some waves was Lobo. And Lobo was invented it was created by DC Comics creator. I can't remember who created him specifically, but he was created with the idea that he was supposed to be like an anti-hero. He was supposed to make fun of people like Wolverine, who were like these series, but everybody liked him, and he was like, oh, geez, this guy's an asshole, and everybody likes him. It doesn't make any sense, but all right, but we'll keep making him. But that was kind of what DC had going for them. I mean, yes, Batman as a movie property was huge, right? There was nothing really touching Batman as a movie property, but their comic properties were not doing as well. And so when Image is formed, suddenly there's a whole bunch of new comic books that are in the market that kids were like myself were buying. So if there were any DC comics that we were buying at all, which really we weren't, a lot of us weren't buying DC at that time. But if there was anything we were buying, right, it went to Image. Whenever Image could be bothered to get their books out. I think Todd McFarlane and was it Mark Silvestri? I think Silvestri. They were good at getting theirs out. So you think of like Spawn, Witchblade. Those ones were definitely out. But I mean, like Rob Liefeld, I mean, you think about how young he was. I mean, he was in his early 20s when he broke away with them to form Image. And I mean, he just kind of ran like they kind of in the documentary they kind of make it seem like it was like a frat club where they're just kind of just doing their own thing. But when they got books out, you were more likely to buy those. Valiant ends up coming up with Magnus Robot Fighter and Turok the Dinosaur Hunter. Suddenly, that was another piece that was like it was digging into the bottom lines on these comic books, and DC was really feeling it, and they were looking for a win of some sort, and their win that they came up with was, we're going to kill off Superman. And the funny thing about this is that if you're not of a certain age, I mean, like if you were younger, like if you were born like I think in the mid '80s, you might not even know that this happened, that Superman was killed off, because everybody knew he was going to come back to life eventually. But the speculative comic book market had gotten to be so big that was DC's gamble, was that we'll kill Superman off, everybody's going to buy this, and that's going to get them back into DC. And it was a lot of people that didn't collect comics that bought this instead. So like for me, I was kind of on my way out from collecting comics, but I still collected them, and I was kind of known. It was 8th grade when this happened as someone who collected, and I was like, I'm not buying that thing. What do I need that? What do I need Death of Superman for? It's not going to be worth anything. Everybody's going to buy it. And I believe that was the one that kind of ripped the bottom out of the or caused the bottom to fall out, or the bubble to burst on the whole speculative comic book market, because I don't even know what it's worth today. There's a vendor, a street vendor in Philadelphia who has comic books, and I think he has a Death of Superman comic book. It's in a white package. I thought I remembered it being in a black package, but maybe it was in a white package, because you had to have it sealed, right? Because that was the whole thing. You want these comics to be sealed, because if you actually wanted to read the comic, you have to buy 2, because it's not worth as much if you rip open the plastic bag that it's in. So you got to buy 2 of them, so you can have one that's sealed and one that you actually read. That was part of the process. That was part of the deal there with that. So they killed Superman off in 1993. That was their big move there, the death of Superman. I don't remember when he came back to life. I don't remember when they brought him back, but we all knew he was going to come back at some point, and he does. At the same time, Batman is still rolling along, right? And it's not like Marvel has capitalized on their popularity with their comic book characters to make movies. And at the same time, also, they start losing money, right? Because they've lost this huge glut of talent, because they wanted to stand firm on being the old comic book way, like kind of the old Stan Lee way of like, oh, if you create a character for us, then it's our character. You don't get any say in it. You don't get any money for it, for any of the money that these characters make. Like Deadpool is making money for, he's not making any money for Rob Liefeld. He's just making it for Disney. That's how it's going to be. And because they held firm, they lost all this talent and thought they'd be able to survive it. They thought that the characters were more important than the talent involved, and that just wasn't the case. Marvel's kind of seeing that now, right? That they thought they were more important than the talent. Actually, I don't want to say that they're seeing it the same way, because it wasn't like they could just say, Robert Downey Jr., you keep making Iron Man movies if you don't want to keep making Iron Man movies. If you're not under contract, you don't want to keep making them, then we've got to pivot to something else. That's the joke in Deadpool and Wolverine, right? Is that Deadpool tells Wolverine, you're going to be making movies for Marvel until you're 90, because that's the thing, right? Is that the talent matters when it comes to this kind of thing, just as much as the characters matter. It's who's writing the stories, who's drawing them, or who's performing them in the film, and who's directing the movies. All of that still matters, and I think Marvel learned that lesson the hard way. Eventually they go bankrupt, right? I think at some point, Disney kind of saves them, but I mean they were in bad shape financially at this time, so they couldn't capitalize on any new popularity with their characters because they couldn't make any movies, and so that's when they tried to have the Spider-Man in what was it, the Cannon Spider-Man that they tried to push, which Albert Bjorn actually went to Golan-Globus after, I don't know if he did it after Superman. He was trying to pitch. Supposedly, he also pitched a fifth Superman movie to them as well. But they were just like, they just didn't have the money for it. But yeah, so anyway, I'm getting off track. Batman is still kind of moving well in the theater. It's still a prestige role, right? You're still getting big names to play the leads and to play the baddies and all of that, right? So you get Batman Forever that has Val Kilmer taking over for Michael Keaton. It's got Nicole Kidman, who was a huge star at that time. It's got Tommy Lee Jones as one of the baddies. It's got Jim Carrey as one of the baddies, right? So these are big names that are pulling in hundreds of millions of dollars per picture, and so they're still being attached to these movies. So that was still working well for them, but until it's not, right? But because it was still working well for them, and Tim Burton is still kind of considered the architect of this greatness, in the late 90s, Warner goes to him about making a Superman movie. And he has this idea of making a Superman movie with Nicolas Cage as Superman. And they actually started to produce this thing. They started, the early production stages of it in the late 90s. And then Batman and Robin does so poorly that Warner pulls the plug. And they say, no, we're not doing this. So, we think of David Zaslav as the guy who pulls the plug on movies, right? But it seems like Warner's been doing this for a while, because they pulled the plug on this Tim Burton Superman that could have been really fun. They pulled the plug on Supergirl, but TriStar picked it up and did something with it anyway. So it seems like they're just pulling the plug on stuff. That just seems to be how they work. But anyway, at this point, they're kind of out of comic books for a little bit. They get it. I mean, obviously, there's the Catwoman movie, which probably didn't make them want to do comic books any more than that. But that comes out in 2004. And I think it's around that time that they start developing this Superman Returns movie. And interestingly enough, I can't remember who it was that they had somebody else originally attached to this movie who wrote it. And he wrote this whole crazy concept of, like, it was completely different from what we understand Superman to be. He'd completely changed the canon, the story, the history, all of that. And then, Bryan Singer is making the X-Men movies. He's having a lot of success making these X-Men movies for Fox. And Warner taps him to make this Superman movie. And of course, he scraps this story idea that he didn't. I think it was J.J. Abrams who was coming up with this story idea that was just kind of all over the place. He scraps it and he comes up with this idea of a soft reboot of the original series. So essentially what this is it kind of takes place after part 2, but it's as if you take part 2 and you push it forward into the future, so that I guess part 2 ended in 2001 or something like that. That's, I guess, the rough idea with that. But the characters are supposed to kind of be within that continuity, roughly. Kinda. That's the idea. So that's what they're going to do for this movie. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that Batman Begins comes out around the same time. So Warner is looking at rebooting both of these franchises. And I don't know if you can hear me typing here because I didn't pull up Batman Begins right away. So they're kind of looking at, and of course they get another big name for these. They get Christopher Nolan, right? So you get Christopher Nolan for Batman, you get Singer for Superman, and I think there was a sense of like, okay, DC's going to get back in the ring here because they had kind of fallen off to Marvel. The Spider-Man movies in particular were doing really well. The Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. the X-Men movies were doing well. It's not like everything was going well though for Marvel, because they were having trouble with their Punisher with Thomas Jane didn't do well. The Daredevil with Ben Affleck didn't do well. So it's not like they were completely coming up roses, but they definitely had two franchises that were making a good amount of money and doing better than anything DC was doing at that time, which is something DC wasn't used to. So okay, let's get our two big names back and let's do something big with them. So Batman Begins comes out in 2005, and it doesn't do horribly, right? It does well. It's got a budget of $150 million, and it pulls in 375. So just shy of 400, but still kind of so not quite that coveted mark of 3 times its budget. But it does well enough that they want to do a sequel of it. And of course, that sequel is really where it kind of takes off for them. They have a large amount of buzz on that sequel based on the fact that with Heath Ledger's passing away, and everybody wanted to see his Joker, and they were riveted by it, and I think that just created a huge, I don't really want to say, like, it became a moment. It became something that everybody needed to see in the theater, which of course I didn't see in the theater. I saw it way later, rented it on Netflix. That was when Netflix was kind of first starting with the disc. And I remember actually everybody was saying how amazing it was, and I remember I talked to one of my friends, I think it's my friend Ian, he was like, I kind of didn't like it. I'll be honest. And I was like, that's interesting. All right. So I watched it with him. And I think the first thing that struck me, because I hadn't seen Batman Begins, so I started right on Dark Knight, I was struck by the voice. I was like, wait, why is Batman talking like that? Why does he have this really weird voice? That doesn't make any sense. And, when I looked at it, I don't know. It didn't. It doesn't make my top 5 for comic book movies, but I know a lot of people really liked it. And obviously it did over $1 billion. So it was like this huge success. So I think there was a thought that they were going to do well with both of these, because they bring out this second one here, this Superman Returns. I think what happens with this movie is, one, it's like $100 million more to make than the Batman movie. So there's that part of it. So even though it makes more money than the Batman movie, when you take out the budget part, it doesn't do quite as well when you think of it that way. So there's that piece of it. But I think the other piece of it, and when I watched this, I was struck by this piece, because I had never seen Superman Returns before. This is my first time seeing it. I remember it being in the theater. I remember I was living at the University of Maine, actually that friend Ian at the time, and some other friends were visiting, and they went to see it. And I was like, I don't really have any interest in doing this. I didn't have a lot of money that summer anyway. And I was just like, well, if I'm going to spend on anything, I don't want to go this. I'll go see something, at the cheap theater that they had in Bangor. I didn't have any interest in that. But it was kind of enough of a moment that people wanted to see it. I think it was, not like the way that the Dark Knight was, but it was something that people were interested in seeing and wanting to get out there and have it. And so it's why it did as well as it did theatrically, in the box office. But anyway, maybe I should get into the plot on it and why I think that's what ultimately kills it. Because I think that's the issue, is that this thing, because it doesn't know what it wants to be. Is it a reboot? Is it a legacy sequel? Is it something in between 2 and 3? It doesn't know exactly what it wants to be. And then when you start getting into it tonally, it starts to have some of those issues as well. And again, just doesn't, we don't know what we're doing here with it, which is kind of too bad. So the basic plot of it is that Superman left for 5 years because he thought that Krypton still existed. And he thought if there's an idea that Krypton could still exist, he had to go out and find it. Weird understanding of how the law works, that Lex Luthor was up for parole, but because Superman was supposed to testify at his parole hearing and he's away going to Krypton, that on a technicality, Lex Luthor gets out of jail or gets out of prison. It doesn't make any sense. I think he was doing like multiple life sentences. That's not how it works. It's like how when you watch movies where it's like, it's like a PM flick, and it's like, if a cop roughs up a bad actor, like a pedophile or a murderer or something like that, it's like, oh, we roughed him up, well, you gotta let him go because of police brutality. It's like, that's not really how that works. Yes, the cop will still get cited, may get cited, may not get cited. We're seeing the situation in Miami, right, with Tariq Hill, where it's like, we don't know necessarily how that kind of thing, what kind of punishment police officers get for acting badly. But the point is that police brutality, not showing up at a parole hearing if you're supposed to testify, guilty by reason of insanity, like those things don't just void convictions, right? People don't just get out of jail. But that's the thing they want us to believe here, which I get it, that I'm believing that a man from space can live on Earth and fly and have X-ray vision and all that stuff. But I guess I should be able to believe that you can get out of jail because or get out of prison because Superman didn't show up at your parole hearing. But I don't know, whatever. But that's what happens. So when Lex Luthor gets out of jail, he hooks up with an aging billionaire woman just before she dies. So he gets her entire fortune, and he uses that to put together his plan, which is to go to the Fortress of Solitude, grab some crystals, and he wants to kind of build his own like island on the Atlantic Ocean so that it will flood the North America and be like the only land that people can live in, and they're going to pay him a lot of money to live on. I guess that's the basic idea. I guess I don't know. At the same time, Superman comes back. He meets back up with Lois. Lois is pissed off that he left for 5 years and didn't tell her he was leaving. Didn't even say goodbye. He could have just said goodbye, but he didn't. And then also she has a son with is it David Marsden? It's something Marsden, right? The guy who played Cyclops in the X-Men movie. So he was kind of a big enough deal at this time. What is it? Marsden. I should have probably looked it up. James Marsden, not David Marsden. I should have probably had it up ready to go, but I didn't. Marsden. Maybe I should just call him Marsden. But anyway, he's playing Lois's husband, who's played by Kate Bosworth. And they have a son, and the son is being like Lois is like really coddling him. She won't let him eat certain foods. He's got an inhaler, all those kinds of things. But there's some suspicion about who his paternity, like who his actual dad could be. But anyway, so as Lex Luthor's plan starts to unfold, now Superman's got to go and defeat him. Lex Luthor's got kryptonite, so that doesn't help. It's kind of a big mess, but eventually he's able to prevail and win. So that's Superman Returns. It's 2.5 hours roughly of that. I guess there's some places maybe to start with. I think first off is Brandon Routh. What do we think of him as Superman? Because this is the only time he gets to play Superman other than an appearance in Arrow, where he's sort of like a alternate universe Superman, something like that. But anyway, Brandon Routh. And I found out his last name is Routh, not Ruth, from his IMDb page. And it's interesting. He's about like 6 months younger than me. So it's almost like this is my Superman. This is our, my age cohort Superman, because Henry Cavill is like about 4 or 5 years younger. So he's really more of a millennial. This is like the closest thing we have to a Gen X Superman is Brandon Routh. And what I would say, I guess, right, or maybe Dean Cain, I guess, would also fit in that category. But from a big screen, I should say a big screen Superman, he's the closest one to Gen X for that. I'm trying to think Dean Cain, how old he is. Because I think he was born in the 60s, if I'm not wrong. He's got to definitely be born in the 60s. He can't be much younger than that. But he's, let's see here. Maybe they don't have his birthday. Oh, no, born in 66. Yeah, so he's a Gen Xer as well. He's definitely kind of more in the Gen X than Brandon Routh, where he and I were kind of more on the cusp of Gen X and millennial. But yeah, I think like Dean Cain, I think if there was like a reboot of Lois and Clark where it was like Brandon Routh and maybe, I don't know, Colby Smulders or somebody like that, Colby Smulders as Lois Lane, where it's kind of like that combination screwball comedy with action elements and adventure and all of that kind of stuff, he would be perfect for that. I don't know this movie, because again, this movie didn't know what it wanted to be, and I don't think Brandon Routh is the name you want for a movie that doesn't know what it wants to be. Because he could do it all, it's just like, how do you want him to do it all? He can play kind of offbeat and goofy. He can also, he's tall and handsome and can play your big leading man character as well. I mean, my wife and I saw a Christmas movie that he did called, I think it was like 9 Kittens for Christmas or something like that. And I think it was actually a sequel. So it's like he's a firefighter, and he's like has a relationship with a vet who I guess she moves to Florida, and then she comes back to their small town. And it's a small town, right? I think in the Pacific Northwest. It's actually just that same town that all of these movies are shot in British Columbia. But anyway, I guess like 9 kittens get dropped off at the firehouse, and so Brandon Routh and this woman, in the process of finding homes for these kittens, they fall back in love. And there's something just very like romantic comedy leading man-ish about Brandon Routh. And it's like one of those things too where you're just like, well, of course this veterinarian is going to dump her husband in Florida for Brandon Routh. Like, why wouldn't she? And he's like walking in his fireman's outfit and all that. So I mean, it's all perfect, right? And I think that kind of Brandon Routh, right? That works there. I mean, I liked him on in Arrow and what was it? Legends of Tomorrow, I think was what was the show he did. That was like within the Arrowverse. He's good in that sense as well. And I think that's one of the things. I think he is good in a TV series where that character can kind of work. You can kind of get to know him better and enjoy him better. Whereas here it was like he shows up and it's like he's having to rebuild this universe or this character. And I think even though they tried to make it seem like they were starting in the middle, we still had to get used to him and understand him. I also think he and Kate Bosworth didn't have the best chemistry. Again, Colby Smulders, there's that scene where Superman, he takes Lois on a trip and he flies her around or whatever. And there's that moment where they're kind of holding each other and they're being lifted off. Like, I could see him and Colby Smulders making that much better. And it's nothing against Kate Bosworth. I think she's good too. It's just between the two of them, I didn't necessarily see that. Lex Luthor, Kevin Spacey is Lex Luthor. Obviously, can't not mention all of the issues with him. I think this is probably slightly before that. Oh, this is not more. This is definitely before that, because I remember in 2013, after the marathon bombings in Boston, my brother and I went and saw the Red Sox play, and we were walking up past the memorial that they'd had for that, and I saw Kevin Spacey sitting in a cafe with some people, but it didn't necessarily look like Kevin Spacey. I wasn't sure, so I didn't nudge my brother and be like, "Oh, look, there's Kevin Spacey." Like, maybe I should have. When I got home, I checked his Twitter account, and it's like, "Oh, that was him," because it showed him a picture of him at that cafe with his friends, and I was like, that actually was Kevin Spacey. And at that time, you could post that you saw Kevin Spacey. He wasn't canceled at that point. The things that we know that he's done, nobody knew he had done them yet at that time. He was just fun Kevin Spacey. What a great guy. I think at the same time, somebody else posted on Tumblr, somebody was doing exercise or something, or they were jogging or something. I think they were taking a break from jogging in Boston. Somebody was taking a picture and he photobombed them. Like, he jumped behind the picture and was like, "Oh, look at how great Kevin Spacey is on Tumblr. He's such a great, nice guy." And then it's like, oh, turns out not so much. But anyway, he's playing Lex Luthor, and at the beginning, his Lex Luthor is very much the Gene Hackman Lex Luthor. Like, he's really, really trying to evoke that Lex Luthor, and then he becomes more Kevin Spacey as the movie goes on. And again, I like Kevin Spacey's Lex Luthor, but I don't know, like the whole plan of, like, I'm gonna build an island in the water and that's how I'm gonna make money because people have to live on the island. It's weird because it worked in the first Superman, because I guess that first Superman was such a better movie, and this, I don't know, for a diabolical scheme, it didn't seem like it was the best. But I think the other thing too is I think they made this movie thinking they were going to get a sequel out of it. I think they thought for sure we were going to have a sequel here, and after this one was done, they decided no on the sequel, which is interesting. I think the reason why they decided no on the sequel, if I were to guess, I think they didn't like the cast involved so much. I think that was part of it. And I really like Brandon Routh, and I like Kate Bosworth. Again, I didn't like them together, but I think to sell the studio on another movie with this pairing, it probably might have been tough. Again, this movie made about $15 million more than Batman Begins, but its budget was like $150 more as well. So it's, that you have to kind of take that as part of it. And so I think that was another piece where they're like, okay, between the two movies, the Batman movie has a better chance of taking off. And of course they played their cards right with that from DC and Warner's standpoint, right? They bet on the right horse, because obviously these next two Batman movies are a lot of money. But by the same token, it would have been nice to see this Superman movie maybe get a sequel, but also if they'd been able to even marry the worlds or put them together there, and they just that doesn't happen. So this ends up being kind of just what it is, which again. Is it what's the term? I think they use the term midquel, right? I think it's like this recent Alien movie. They call it a midquel because it takes place in between two films in a series. This could potentially be a midquel, right? It could also be like completely replacing 3 and 4. So kind of doing like talk about the Highlander movies where Part 3 replaces Part 2, and then Endgame. I think is that the one that has Adrian Paul? It's like a different version of Part 2. It's its own Part 2. So it's like we have 3 Part 2 Highlander Part 2s. This is its own Part 3. This is a different Part. We've got 2 Part 3s, I guess. That's another idea with this. But I think it's a big problem here is that it was never fully clear what this movie was supposed to be. Was it within the continuity? Because if it was within the continuity, then making it set in 2005 was wrong. If it was part of the continuity, they should have had it set in what, 1988? I guess no, because 83 was part 3, so it would have been 1985. right? And how much fun would that have been if they'd set this in 1985, right? There could have been a lot of stuff they could have done there that would have been really cool. And on the one hand, you go, well, you set it in that time, it's going to cost a lot of money. I mean, this thing costs like $200 million to make. Like, you can't make a period picture for $200 million. I don't know. And of course they had to they redo a lot of the, actually it's $270 million. Jeez. Okay. So yeah, you definitely could have done a 1985 period. I mean, Wonder Woman did it, right, with Wonder Woman 84. So I guess you could have done it, right? And I think it would have been received better, right? If that was what they did. I think, what was I going to say? I completely lost track of what I was going to say after I had that piece there. I think that's one piece of it, right? Is that nobody knew where this was supposed to take place, and I think when you're making a big budget blockbuster thing like that, it's got to be clear where it's coming from, because it's trying to be a big tentpole kind of thing. But even as a small tent approach to a Superman movie, I think not being clear on where it takes place or within what timeline or any of those kinds of things, I think that was kind of frustrating for me even watching it and being like, well, how am I supposed to anchor in on this here? Because there wasn't really anything for me to anchor to. I mean, the performances were good. I mean, that was definitely there. I think the story, again, I could have gone for a better story. I mean, the other thing too is that we've now had Lex Luthor as the baddie in 4 of the 5 movies that we're talking about here. The only one that he's not the baddie is the the third movie, right, where we've got Robert Vaughn, where it's just like we couldn't get Gene Hackman, so we'll just get another billionaire and have him be the Lex Luthor surrogate or whatever. And Superman, it's not like he doesn't have the best villains gallery, right? I mean, obviously he's not the Batman villains gallery, he's not the Spider-Man villains gallery, but he had other villains. They could have used somebody else. Brainiac, I think they've talked about using. I think they were maybe thinking about having Brainiac for the next movie if they'd gotten this far, but they didn't get that far, right? That's the thing. Especially when you're dealing with Warner, right? These sequels aren't guaranteed for you, and so that's kind of it. So this again has a unique legacy because it comes out in that period of in 06 where DC's trying to kind of regain its footing from Marvel, and it looks like they accomplish it more with the Batman movie. I don't know if they would have tried if they thought about doing another one of these movies, if they'd put it together and made it happen, if the momentum of The Dark Knight Rises might have been enough, if they had staggered these the way they staggered the first ones, where it was Batman Begins in 2005, and then this was in 2006. So then Batman. So I think The Dark Knight was I'm trying to think when that was. Was it 09 or 08? I think it was something along those lines, right? It was 08, right? 08, of course, right? Of course, 08, right? So we're thinking about timing it with the start of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So Dark Knight comes out in 08. So if in 09 you had Batman, the sequel to Superman Returns, if you had another Superman movie, I feel like the momentum from Dark Knight would have paid off on this, because we've seen it work like that with other comic book movies. So we saw, for example, with Avengers. I mean, Avengers, especially the Endgame and Infinity War, they created such a pull, like a tidal pull, or the force of that had just pulled up all of these ships, right? The rising water of the Avengers movies pulled up all of these ships. So you get $1 billion earner in Black Panther, $1 billion earner in Captain Marvel. You get Aquaman is $1 billion earner. People were just so into comic book movies, and I think Dark Knight had that potential to, people would have liked that so much they would have been like, oh, let me go see what this Superman movie is all about, and especially depending on what they did with it and how it was advertised, I think it could have had legs and maybe not done $1 billion, but 600-700 I think would have been on the table. But again, it's Warner, right? Warner doesn't always know what they're doing with these things, and I think they felt like, okay, well, we had played it safe with Batman by just going with Batman. We're going to be okay here. And of course, it's after this that Marvel takes over, right? It's something that we don't see coming necessarily. I don't think DC would be forgiven for not seeing it coming, because they had they could look at it as we've killed it again, right? We've made the right decision here again. We're successful here again. And Iron Man in 2008, it's not looking like anything. Right? It wouldn't look like anything that would scare DC. It wouldn't look like anything that DC would recognize as something to be afraid of. The same way also that, Fox and Sony also wouldn't have been afraid of it. And so, it still made, over $500 million. But, when you're comparing that to what The Dark Knight did, where it's like this cultural phenomenon, yeah, you look at that and you'd say, okay, we're pretty safe here with the decisions we're making. We like the decisions we're making. We don't really need to worry about it. And then, of course, when the Marvel Cinematic Universe takes off fully, right, so that by the time Dark Knight Rises comes out, you get the first Avengers movie, and it beats it, right? It comes out and I don't say destroys it, but it definitely does better than it by a good amount. That's when DC's like scrambling at that point. And it's like, had they had the foresight to push Superman along, they might have already had their shared universe ready to go. I guess, Nolan only wanted to make 3 movies, and so I don't know if you would have had to maybe reboot Batman anyway, to some extent. But they could have had that connected universe already set and in motion. But instead, they were like, no, okay, we're only going to do one or the other, right? We're only going to do Superman or Batman. And between the two, Batman did better, so we'll throw in our lot with Batman, which was the right move because it made a lot of that money. But I think it was the wrong move, too, because I think they could have done something with Superman. And I guess the other thing is that what made the decision probably easier for Warner was the fact that this movie was kind of so all over the place. Like, Batman Begins is really, it's a true reboot. We know exactly what we're getting when we watch Batman Begins. We know what Christopher Nolan's doing. We know who Christian Bale is, right? They're restarting everything. This is all completely new. Whereas this movie was somewhere in between, a soft reboot, a midquel, a replacement of other sequels. Any number of things it could have been. And because it wasn't really clear what it was, the same way that Batman Begins, I think it's another piece of maybe why Warner would have thrown their weight behind Batman and shelved Superman, is that they could say, okay, we know what we're getting with Batman, right? We're going to let this thing go. We got Heath Ledger lined up to play the Joker. That should be good. And then, of course, he dies tragically. But also there's so much buzz going around about his performance that it was like everybody had to see it. Of course, except for me. I saw it on DVD later, but that was that. So I guess, as we're kind of wrapping up this series here, with this look at the Superman movies, it's a very fascinating, when we think of comic book franchises, it's such a fascinating one because, you wonder, probably one of the best comparisons is the Batman series, right? Because they both kind of fall off on the 4th movie. And then, whereas when they reboot Batman fully in 05, they don't fully reboot it here with 06 when they come back with the new Superman. And maybe had they rebooted things with Brandon Routh and made it completely new, maybe that would have been something that we would have appreciated and liked better. I think the other thing, too, that would have been interesting is what if they, instead of using Lex Luthor, right, if they reboot this thing and they use Brainiac as the baddie, or Bizarro Superman or something like that. They use a different baddie, the same way that the Batman Begins movie had Scarecrow, right? We hadn't seen Scarecrow in any of the movies. They bring in Scarecrow and then they give us Joker, right? It's almost like this anticipation of wanting to see Joker, but we don't get him right away. That would have been an interesting play here, right? Is that we get Brainiac in this movie, and then, Kevin Spacey's Joker's coming in 09. Look out for that. That might have been another way to do this. But it ends up being this interesting island of a film within this series. So that, the same way that you've got the Batman 4 movies, you've got the 4 Superman movies, and then you've got this other thing that's just sort of attached to it. Plus, you've got Supergirl that's sort of just kind of floating around there. Again, different from the Batman ones where you get that Catwoman movie that definitely doesn't have any connection to anything, right? That Catwoman movie, that's not like, it would have been interesting if that Halle Berry Catwoman, sorry, I was counting Catman. What's Catman? That's the Godfrey Ho movie, right? Catman and Boxer's Blow or whatever. But, Catwoman, that movie, it would have been interesting if that movie was adjacent to the Burton Schumacher Batman films, right? That would have been an interesting take on that. And I think Halle Berry, it would have been I think it would have worked better in that sense if she was kind of playing a version of the Michelle Pfeiffer Catwoman. And it was kind of in that universe and done that style. The same way that Supergirl is in the universe of the Superman films. And it's kind of that style. I mean, her outfit looks similar to a Superman outfit. The planets, all of that stuff is the same. It would have been interesting if that, because that's also kind of an interesting parallel, right? Is that you've got Supergirl and Catwoman as these two sort of female-led pieces of the franchises, but Catwoman's not a part of the franchise the way Supergirl is. So But then, of course, the other thing too is that I don't think you can compare Superman 4 with Batman and Robin. Batman and Robin was still a major production. It was a big screen deal, one of the major studio production, as opposed to Superman 4, which is it's canon. It's a Cannon Films movie, so it's I think it's interesting when we look at these comic book series, because again, Superman 1 and 2 are objectively two of the best comic book movies of all time. They're, as I've talked about before, they're the archetype of what people look for in comic book movies. They lay a lot of the groundwork for how comic book movies are made, how they unfold, how they develop. And so you've got that, and then you've got 3, which is such a departure, and it's just kind of it's such a fascinating movie in there with the different characters and all that, and it's sort of the way it was sort of splitting the difference on the idea that Ilya Salkind had come up with Brainiac and Mr. Mxyzptlk or whatever his name is, and Supergirl, trying to put them all in one movie and then being like, okay, we're not going to put any of them in the movie. We're going to do this thing with Richard Pryor and Robert Vaughn. And then we get the Cannon entry, and then we get this. Oh, no, I don't want to forget Supergirl, right? We get Supergirl, then we get the Cannon entry, and then we get this film. It's a fascinating series of 5 movies, and comparing it, I don't know what I would compare it to, because it's not like the Star Trek movies, because those kind of tonally all fit together as 6 movies. Same with the Batman movies. Say what you want about Batman and Robin or Batman Forever, they all kind of at least fit in a way that these 5 movies or 6 movies, they're kind of a little bit unique. I think it's those first the first 4 or the first 3 plus Supergirl fit a little bit better, and then these last 2 that we've talked about here, they're these interesting additions to the series. So very fascinating. And I mean, Superman is just going to be a fascinating character. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with him in 2025 when James Gunn uses him to reboot their DC universe, because when Superman is made in 2013. Right, I think he was the Henry Cavill film. I think was supposed to be kind of a Zack Snyder standalone thing. John from After Movie Diary kept calling him Hack Snyder when I was on his show recently. But that was supposed to be a standalone thing. But because Avengers is so big, it's like, well, we got to go big here, and that's when they bring in Batman and Wonder Woman for the sequel and start this whole DC universe thing. But they can never quite get it to work with Superman. In that DC extended universe, and it's interesting because he starts the DC extended universe just like he's going to be starting here. So he's still kind of the number one in that sense, that Batman, he's kind of doing his own thing with the Robert Pattinson movies, and so this is I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how they do it. It's going to be interesting to see how James Gunn, what his take is on it, how it looks, because again, this is a very heavy shadow that Christopher Reeve cast with those first 2 movies. And, DC wasn't able to get out from under it in their previous iteration. So it'll be interesting to see if they're able to pull it off now. But I don't know. I don't know. We'll see. I'll be saving my money. I'll probably see it in the theater for sure. I see 3 movies a year roughly. I'm going to go see Venom. That's probably the next one I'll see. So that's actually going to be... Yeah, that'll be 3, I guess, if you count Cinderella's Revenge. I don't know if I count that one as a... I didn't see it in the theater, but it's not a big budget film. But anyway, I'm kind of starting to ramble here, so why don't we wrap this up? But I think, final thoughts on Superman Returns as well, because I didn't quite give those. It's an interesting movie. I wish it had a better identity in terms of what it was. I think if it had wanted to be a replacement sequel to Part 3, I think they should have just gone all in on that and set it in 1985 and used 1985 sets and put that $270 million to that. And even with the special effects, use more of those kinds of special effects. The wire work, all of those kinds of things. Try to make them work in a modern context, but I think that would have been a better play than what we got here. Or just reboot it. Just reboot it the way you did with Christian Bale and Christopher Nolan did with Batman Begins. That would have maybe been a better bet as well. But it was a fun time going through these movies. I think Superman is a fascinating character, and I think you can really see it in watching these 5 movies, plus the Supergirl one as the 6th one. Really interesting stuff, and it's going to be interesting to see what comes from here. But anyway, why don't we wrap up here, because I've gone a good amount over than I was planning to for this. So again, you can find me dtvconnoisseur.blogspot.com. That's the site. That's where you get everything, including links to this podcast here, links to my novels. Most recent novel, Don's House in the Mountains. You can get that one Kindle, paperback, Kindle Unlimited. Looking to get a new novella out soon. It's going to be called Nadia and Aiden. The idea is these are fraternal twins who their mother is originally from Philadelphia. She moves to Paris. She meets this guy Mads, who is played a part in some of my flash fiction. They have two children together, fraternal twins, Nadia and Aiden. They're born in like 1988, and they come to America in 2008 to get in touch with their American heritage. So that's kind of the idea. So it's kind of a snapshot of America at that time. I play with the narrative a little bit because they're sort of two narrators together, so it's a dual narrator. So kind of, that's why I made it a novella, because I don't know how long I could sustain that dual narrator piece for so long. But look for that sometime in the fall, maybe. Or we're in the fall now, but I think November. That's probably the target that I'm going to push for to get that out. But yeah, keep an eye out for that. So we'll have something new soon. But for right now, if you haven't gotten it yet, you can pick up Don's House in the Mountains as well. I'm always happy, and anybody picks up any of my books, it's always always really appreciate that. So yeah, but with that, why don't we call it good here? So thank you everybody for listening, and we'll be back soon. Bye everyone.